Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to all. My name is Leslie Head and I'm the President of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Welcome to this second of our President's Conversations. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the Canberra region, and where the Academy is hosting today's meeting. I myself join you from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where my Australian-based colleagues are located today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. We know that climate change threatens many valued parts of Australia's heritage estate, both cultural and natural, from our most spectacular and well-known sites and places to lesser known but equally valued ones. From tangible places and objects to intangible dimensions. At the same time, there are many other interacting threats to heritage. Mining activity, land use change, trammelling of Indigenous rights, and insufficient legislative protection. Today's session is not just about threats and what we need to do about them. We also hope to dig deeper. We often think of heritage as the bits of the past that we want to preserve. But how might we need to rethink this as we move away from historical baselines with the climate change that's already baked in? What does it mean for the National Reserve System, for example, if it needs to move as climates move? Do we need to reconceptualise heritage completely? And what can we learn from the international context? So we've got a wonderful panel to help us think through these issues today. If you encounter any technical difficulties through the session, please contact our Academy events team, events@humanities.org.au. Just to remind us all of Zoom etiquette, even though most of us are quite used to it now, the session's being recorded and it'll be uploaded to the Academy's YouTube account. We will also have a list of further reading on the Academy website that includes some publications by the people speaking today. Just a reminder to please mute when you're not speaking and use the chat or raise hand functions to ask questions or comment. We hope to have a good deal of time at the end to engage in discussion with the audience. So let me introduce our speakers. Peter Jeffries is a senior Pinakura man on his mother's side, is Ngaluma on his father's side. Peter is Chief Executive Officer of Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation. Joe McDonald is Director of the Centre for Rock Art Research and Management at the University of Western Australia. Tiffany Morrison co-leads the People and Ecosystems program in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook Uni. Madison Miller is a Darug woman living on Woiwurrung Wurundjeri lands. She's an archaeologist and researcher at the University of Melbourne. And Chris Ballard teaches and researches on archaeology and anthropology at the Australian National University. So firstly, I'm going to hand over to Joe and Peter, who are going to do a tag team of some sort. Over to you, Joe.
Joe, you're on mute.
Sorry, try that again. There we go. Okay, can you all see that now?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Leslie. I begin today by acknowledging that I'm on Whadjuk Noongar land and I'm speaking today from that country, from that Whadjuk. I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and to their elders past, present and future. Peter is somewhere different to me, even though my background looks like I'm actually on Murujuga. He is in Murujuga. Peter?
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon all. I'm speaking on behalf of the traditional owners that make up Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, the Ngaluma, Yindjibarndi, Yaburara, Morodonia and Wangatu people.
So we are going to start talking about this landscape. We know from the archaeological evidence that Aboriginal people have been living on this northwest coast for at least 50,000 years. And that since this time, there's been extreme climate change. The place that we're talking about today, which is now an archipelago, was once an inland desert range. Peter, would you like to talk about that?
Yep. Our law or our culture that has been passed down to us since the beginning of time has always informed us or told us about the land being a lot further than the current location. We have stories about what we call the Mangurtu or the flood that affected this area, and as I said before, these stories are passed down from generation to generation, and it tells about our law, how people act and what they need to do when they're out on country with regards to the animals, the plants, and all that other what do you call it, things that affect our culture.
And one of the things that as archaeologists we've been really interested in trying to track this cultural change and response to this major environmental change that people have experienced is the way that the rock art tracks that change from a deep past through to the more recent record, which is maritime focused, and where the animals in fact depict a whole series of landscapes and fauna and that are in the current sphere. This has obviously changed significantly over the whole period of time that people have been living in this landscape. And we see people not only changing their interest in what is in that landscape, but also the way they signal their identity through that time.
And some of the other things that we see here, in our rock art is we see stories like the Emini or the Jangwana story about how we hunted at a particular time to gather emu eggs, and the story with regards to the emu, but how we went to different types of locations all over the particular country to hunt food at different times of the seasons across the country.
So as archaeologists, we've started to track some of these differences which show people have been in this landscape for an extremely long period of time. And we have a series of sites which we found in the intertidal zone. So this is the interstitial area, if you like, between the wet and the dry. It's between the high tide and the low tide. And this site that we've actually found on Dolphin Island is one of the first ones that we've documented that actually show people have stopped living in a landscape. You could still live on this landscape because it's obviously accessible at low tide, but in fact it's more likely that people in fact lived in these sorts of landscapes before the sea level got to where it is now. We've also got more recently evidence of artefacts which are below the low tide mark, so fully submerged. And this paper came out last year documenting more than 200 artefacts in this channel up in the north of the archipelago. On the right-hand side, that visualization is showing the removal, the actual digital removal of the incrustation on the outside of that artifact that we did to ensure that in fact we were looking at real artifacts. You can see from the nude artifact that in fact it's got a whole series of the diagnostic things that we are looking for.
Yeah, and our research with UWA and the Flinders team has helped us demonstrate the significance of submerged landscape, but more importantly, it has now, I think, given us scientific information that have confirmed our stories that have been passed down through the generations that our ancestors used to live further out on the country, and it's because of this information, I think, when our rangers go out and we start talking to visitors to this country now, not only can we provide that cultural context to tourists that come to the region now, but we're able to provide also some scientific knowledge about the Mura and about our strong connection to the beginning.
And certainly the work that we did with Deep History of Sea Country, but also more recently trying to work out whether there'd be any impacts on underwater Indigenous cultural heritage along potentially a development like the Scarborough gas pipeline, we've developed these predictions for the sorts of sites which might be the most impacted by sea level rise. And therefore, we were working backwards, of course, trying to actually work out which sorts of sites would in fact still remain for archaeologists to be able to locate on the seabed. And so we've gone through a process of trying to define the different types of sites that we might expect to remain underwater. And I think in terms of the message that we're wanting to promulgate today is that, of course, if the sea level rise, which is predicted to occur in the next time period, obviously this will have effect on heritage all around the Australian coastline. We've got an example here from a landscape that we've excavated out on Enderby Island, which is one of the outer islands of the archipelago. And we've excavated 2 separate locations, one in a sand body in the centre of this valley, and the other next to a large waterhole up amongst the vast numbers of engravings that you can see that have been recorded along this particular landscape to the west of that particular excavation. These two types of excavations show the distinction between these durable sites as opposed to the ones which are more ephemeral and which probably won't survive a major inundation, perhaps by water. They tell the same story. They tell that people were in this landscape before the sea level got to this part of the archipelago, that there's a really intensive period of occupation at the late Pleistocene, early Holocene time. And then when you actually think about those 2 landscapes that we showed, and again, this is using the LiDAR data from that we flew across that island to try and identify the subsea potential. You can see this is now getting towards what is high tide now. And then if you add a metre of water to that, you can actually see that valley starting to fill up. And then if you actually think about that, you're going to have cyclonic conditions and various other things that will in fact continue to impact and potentially raise the sea level by another a metre or so during an extreme cyclonic event. You can see that entire Holocene dune at the front of that valley will probably be washed away. And in fact, we're going to get archaeology that disappears beneath the waterline. So that's really that's what we wanted to say, is that this is an extraordinary landscape that we are managing to identify the archaeology obviously above the land, above the water level now, starting to find it below the sea as well. But obviously there are implications for ongoing climate change in terms of how we can manage, as heritage managers can actually think about those landscapes and what's going to happen as that sea level continues to rise. Peter, do you want to finish?
Thanks, Joe. At Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, our land and sea rangers, our young Indigenous land and sea rangers, are out on patrol every day of the week, observing the country and determining the appropriate management strategies. They are the first observers to observe change on the Ngurra and how the changes are the interactions between the elements in the environment. We rely on the rangers to sit down and record this evidence to maintain the balance and then increase and then give us that feedback on what is happening in the environment, especially around the increased pressure with regards to industry, tourism and climate change. It is not the first time we've encountered a massive social, environmental and climate change, but the challenge of managing our vast cultural estate is a window into what Australia and the rest of the world will need to think about in terms of their cultural heritage in these coastal zones. With science, we can tell, or we should be able to be more aware of the changes that we're seeing now within the Ngurra.
Thank you for having us both. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, both of you. That's a great introduction, taking us back in time and also forward in time in some pretty spectacular landscapes. So we're going to cross to the other side of the continent now, and I'll hand over to Tiffany Morrison on the northeast coast.
Can you see that? Yep. Thanks, Peter and Joe, for such a really important talk, and Leslie for inviting me here today. I acknowledge that I'm presenting here today from the lands of the Wulga Wulkaba people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all joining from. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a political geographer. I work on improving the environmental governance of 257 ecosystems listed as World Heritage for their outstanding universal value to humanity. My work is focused on uncovering hidden political levers for addressing environmental threats like climate change. I want to preface my talk today by explaining that most World Heritage ecosystems are listed solely for their natural values. Ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef here in this picture, Lord Howe Island and Ningaloo. There are no reef ecosystems listed for both cultural and natural values in Australia, and only one in the world, which is the Hawaiian listing, which only came through in 2010. Partly, I think this is because for a long time, reefs have been perceived as something out there in the vast blue ocean, often not completely visible to decision makers. We now know, of course, and acknowledge that billions of people are intimately connected to and depend on coral reefs, and always have been, but this has not yet been reflected in the World Heritage System. What is, however, being increasingly reflected in the World Heritage System is the effect of climate change on the world's coral reef heritage. You may have recently seen images like this one in the national and international news media. While starkly beautiful to the layperson, this is a bleached coral reef. To the right is what a reef looks like after a bleached coral has failed to recover and algae has taken over, preventing further coral regrowth. Climate-induced marine heating events means that bleaching like this is occurring more frequently and challenging the capacity of heritage reefs to recover between temperature extremes. At the same time, there are many other threats to reef heritage, including insufficient efforts to control mining activity and coastal land use change on the edge of reefs, and lack of recognition of Indigenous rights. Which brings me to the role of UNESCO and its World Heritage Committee. When I first arrived in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies in 2015, the Great Barrier Reef had just been proposed for an in danger listing, but was ultimately not listed as in danger. Despite scientific concern about rising threats to the reef, scientists and policymakers seem to agree on the disadvantages of an in danger listing, such as the effect on tourism. However, this consensus did not appear to be based on fact or experience elsewhere, which I found curious as a social scientist. So I decided to undertake a global longitudinal analysis of every UNESCO decision for all 257 ecosystems since 1972. I wanted to ask, how do other threatened sites fare in the overall system? How does the Great Barrier Reef compare? And what is the situation for other climate impacted sites? What I found is that climate change is fast becoming an urgent international relations problem for UNESCO. Traditionally, climate decisions have been avoided and delegated to the Intergovernmental Panel and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Climate reporting on individual World Heritage sites is typically lagged by up to 10 years behind known climate impacts. And as you may be aware from recent media coverage, climate progress is being undermined by a small group of member states, including Australia, who claim that UNESCO should not supersede national sovereignty on climate and who block in danger listings for climate impacted properties using lobbying, rhetoric, symbolism, and placebo policies. So Leslie asked me to speak on what we can learn from this international analysis. First, the results of this analysis challenge UNESCO's typical assumption that poor governance only happens in less advanced economies. We show that rich countries like Australia have just as strong incentives to avoid international intervention and oversight. The influence of powerful industries in capturing decision makers to block environmental governance is prevalent in all countries with a high dependence on natural resource industries such as mining and forestry. Second, we also found that positive changes are afoot. The UNESCO decision to not list the GBR as in danger this year was not a final decision. It was a decision to postpone, and the in danger listing will be considered again next year. In the meantime, the Australian government will have to defend its inaction on climate to the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow in November. In December, for the first time, UNESCO and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will meet, and a new draft UNESCO policy that clearly states that climate-related degradation of a World Heritage Area can be used as the basis for an in danger listing will be considered for ratification later this year at the UNESCO General Assembly. Reef scientists and managers are also beginning to reconceptualise reef heritage management as reef species respond to episodic climate extremes and a dynamic new normal emerges. Scientists are grappling with the idea of moving from a paradigm which was about preserving valued parts of the charismatic past to a new paradigm which is much more about managing dynamic and probably ugly decline to prevent ultimate system collapse. The old paradigm, best represented by the ecologically redundant but charismatic Nemo fish on the top left, is a much easier sell for managers than the new paradigm, which is best represented by the ecologically important but dowdy surgeon fish and mangrove landscapes at the bottom and the right. I'm not saying that I have these values and these interpretations of these species, but that is the general perception out there that charismatic species are more attractive and easier to use to get policy through. At the same time, we're seeing an alternative universe emerge, one of reef cloud brightening, coral larvae robots, coral gardening, and virtual reefs, which look closer to the stuff of science fiction than many conservationists would prefer. Most of these so-called solutions are untested and temporary stopgaps, which are having the effect of convincing people that climate change can be fixed without having to do the hard winding back of fossil fuels. But they are wielding a lot of influence in the world of heritage lobbying, rhetoric, and symbolism. So as a dynamic new normal emerges and the harsh geopolitics of climate change continue to intensify, my questions for all of us here today are, how can we reconceptualise natural heritage? Can we use the same tactics of rhetoric and symbolism to convince citizens, scientists, and policymakers of the need for different kinds of natural heritage interventions? What does it take to generate a just and green New Deal that puts living land and seascapes and Indigenous rights front and centre? Or are there other solutions that we have not yet considered? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tiffany. That's great. And I might come back to ask you some of your own questions as well. Let's go now to Maddie, who's in the southeast of the continent.
Okey-doke. Thanks, Leslie. So hi, everybody. My name's Maddie and I'm a Darug woman and I live and work on Wurundjeri Bik. I'm very grateful for this country that has kept me safe and nurtured me. And at this time of year in particular, it's quite beautiful here with all the Wurundjeri seasons that we're moving through. And I feel that the days, you can observe the days are getting longer, and I enjoy watching the plants and animals around me as they change. So I pay my respects to the elders of the lands that I'm on and the elders that have passed on to the dreaming. And I thank them for their generosity in the knowledge they share and pledge to do my part in caring for this place while I'm here. My background is as an archaeologist, and I worked in state government for a number of years, as well as working with urban researchers in embedding Indigenous knowledge into their work. I joined the Australian delegation to the UNESCO World Heritage meeting in 2019 as an Indigenous member to the committee, and I just recently took up the position of Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne, looking at Indigenous ecological knowledge and two-way knowing. So this is my childhood home. This is where I grew up, and these are pictures of the same dam from slightly different viewpoints. The Burt image was taken a few weeks after Black Saturday in 2009 when I was able to return home, and the green image was taken in 2021, somewhere in between lockdowns, again when I was able to return home. It's forested areas like this one and like the one I grew up in and the ones that surround it are dominated by eucalyptus, making them particularly flammable. The occurrence of catastrophic bushfires is likely to increase as we continue into this climate emergency. These eucalyptus forests dominate the southeast of Australia, where some 2/3 of Australians live. But forests like these are not just forests, they're country, and country is kin. In the southeast, we have experienced extensive colonisation and massively land-altering events such as gold mining, widespread grazing, broadacre cropping and irrigation. And areas deemed to be natural have also been heavily altered. By removing people from country and not allowing the deep time traditions of country management to continue, these areas have become unhealthy. We cannot ignore that all places are country, and that all of country is a cultural construct. People belong on country, not just for the health of country, but the health of our communities and for strengthening our continued cultural practices. Stories of climate adaptation, of learning from country and resourcefulness are common through Aboriginal cultures. We have, as we saw before, we have stories of the coastline changing. In the southeast, we have stories of volcanic eruptions, and these stories carry with them stories of knowledge of changing, of adapting, and of learning from country. We also hold stories of wildfire and the worries and the things that happen afterwards. Perhaps one of the better known and more celebrated stories comes from Gunditj Mara country, where some 30,000 years ago, the Creator exposed themselves, creating expansive lava flows that altered the country. From that event, Gunditj Mara created extensive aquaculture systems and adapted their way of life into that in a way that sustained community, but also cared for country. And as we think to the future and what climate change continues to bring, we must also think to the past and to understand country and its needs. There are many lessons of climate resilience in our ancestral stories and deep knowledge of what healthy means. I included this quote from Breeding Sweetgrass because I think having worked so long in government and in legislation and in understanding what is heritage and what are the parts in which we protect, I think that we often ignore that it goes beyond what we as archaeologists practice in the stones and the bones and the scar trees and those tangible parts of heritage that we can protect. But it also goes, for me as an Indigenous person, my culture is much more than that. It's more than the physical, tangible remains of the past. It's in practice and it's in the lessons and the learnings of my ancestors. And so I just liked this quote because for me, healing is at the centre of culture, and as we all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are facing climate change, that healing must be centred again. So I might just leave that there. We could go to conversation.
Thanks very much, Maddie. And last but certainly not least, over to Chris Ballard.
Thanks to each of the previous speakers for really amazing insights. Thanks also to Leslie and the Academy for the kind invitation to speak. I'm speaking to you from the unceded country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders and leaders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the various communities that I've worked with in Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu and West Papua, whose ideas essentially I'm communicating today. So, sorry, I seem to, I really want to talk about disasters, in fact, and disasters as opportunities in all sorts of ways. This is an expression that comes from a Ni Vanuatu community I work with, and it was truly inspirational in flipping the way that we think about disasters and their relationship to intangible forms of heritage. So why don't we talk more about disasters in the context of climate change? After all, the human scale of climate change, the experiential scale, is disaster. It's the cyclones, the droughts, the bushfires that we experience and through which we know and understand climate change. Perhaps the rare exceptions are the ones that Peter and Joe are talking about, where Indigenous Australia, they understand the impacts and the temporality of disasters, while climate change is something that remains fairly opaque. And I think that's probably true for most of us. If you think about COVID-19, we read about it incessantly, we watch it on TV, but we experience it from our apartments and our homes at a very local scale. The interesting thing about disasters then is that the history of responses to them are a series of quite remarkable deep history simulations of the scope for climate change adaptation. They map out, in the way that Peter and Joe were showing for Murujuga, the way in which people have responded to changing environments. So they are a register of all the things that we might possibly do as we think into the future and radical climate change. I also want to stress that disasters and culture are mutually constituted. These are not hermetically sealed from each other at all. Firstly, because disasters are culturally and socially defined. We know full well that a hazard on its own is not a disaster. It has to impact on a community or on its infrastructure, and it has to be understood and appreciated as a disaster. And there are very different cultural ways of thinking about what a disaster is. And I think what we see in the long-term histories in Indigenous Australia and in the Pacific, where I work, are cultures that are fantastically adapted to seasonal or even less regular disasters, and indeed even to climate change and sea level rise. So these are cultures that are almost impossible to think apart from disaster and apart from climate change. This was kind of brought home when Cyclone Pam hit in Vanuatu in 2015, when people said, well, that's really interesting that cyclones are being defined as disasters. We don't think of them as disasters. They're natural. Disaster is something else. Disaster is something that unequally affects the population or that damages your capacity to survive, particularly that damages your gardens. That's a disaster. But all the other metrics of disaster have much less cultural valence in many communities. And the third point I want to make really is that the role of cultural heritage discussion in climate change far too often neglects what we call living heritage now, or intangible cultural heritage, or ICH. There has been this enormous focus on what we can see, what we can touch, what we can measure, which is landscapes and built environments. And I think one of the challenges for us now is to reintegrate the tangible and the intangible and think about them in a dynamic frame. So there's been an ongoing shift in discourse on heritage risk from tangible to intangible forms of heritage. And these came together, as I said, this World Heritage Site, Chief Roy Mara's Domain in Vanuatu after Cyclone Pam, where community members said, Cyclone Pam brought with it great winds, but also opportunities. And one of those opportunities is that these disasters are like they're like temporal watersheds, moments when people sit down and go and actually talk about culture and talk about transmission and talk about what's been lost since the last big cyclone, what they did, what they used to do, and what they don't do now. So they are also these moments for quite spectacular cultural reflection and cultural revival. One of the things that I think that UNESCO's focus in ICH on documentation and protection, or inventorying and safeguarding, as they refer to it, it has been a failure to think about ICH transmission, about how knowledge is transmitted in space, in time, in a dynamic mode. And so one of the things that's come out in work that I've been doing with my partner, Meredith Wilson, and with the community in Chief Roy Mara's Domain, the Lalabara villages, is thinking about how we reintegrate and explain to outsiders how the tangible and the intangible and communities depend upon each other to transmit heritage. I'm not going to go into this elaborate table in any great detail, but it's a really simple rubric that comes from the community, talking about people, place, and story. And you cannot have culture and you cannot have heritage without all three of those modalities, all three of those elements, healthy and surviving and thriving. And so what we're pushing for now is a kind of reintegration of the tangible and the intangible, and thinking about how they play out over time, how they incorporate and work with disasters, how they're constantly adapting. And I think that raises all sorts of fascinating questions about the way that we've framed issues like authenticity in the past or value. And I think we need something like this holistic framework to match the holistic way in which people live their lives, especially in traditional communities. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. I think we didn't get the full view of your slide, so I might get you to bring in that table up when we come back in questions, because I think there's stuff we should look at there. But thank you very much, everyone, for that. Was really a most moving and insightful and challenging set of reflections. So the format now is that I'm going to ask each of the presenters a question or have some discussion with them. The presenters will then have an opportunity to ask one another questions, and then we'll open to the floor. So please keep feeling free to put comments or questions in the chat as well. So I'll go first to Peter and to Joe, but my first question's to Peter. You mentioned, Peter, that the young rangers are doing a lot of work on the kind of front line of all these changes, both learning about the past and thinking about future management. Can you tell us a bit more about how they're experiencing all the changes that are going on?
The young Indigenous rangers, I think, have grabbed the opportunity to be able to sit down and listen to people like myself and circle of elders we have within Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation who hold cultural knowledge, and for the young rangers, it's about getting back to the basics about history and understanding culture and where culture fits within our society and how it reflects around the intangible and the tangible heritage around the song lines, and how the song lines then transverse or transgress across the country to other different parts of Western Australia and Australia, and in particular the Central Desert region. So it gives them a more clear understanding from that scientific point of view and the cultural point of view, and being able to amalgamate the two areas to be able to continue to understand that generational conversation piece around passing on of the knowledge.
Yeah, great. And I know that many of those young rangers are involved in the whole big research project with Joe and so on. So Joe, moving to you, I wanted to ask you a kind of personal question, I suppose, in that, you know, as archaeologists, we can look back at past climate changes and think of how they've affected people, and that can be a kind of something we're emotionally distant from. But when you look at the future challenges for management of the archaeological record, how do you deal with that yourself, and how do you prioritise what kinds of work needs to be done?
Oh, thanks, Leslie. I think that's really quite a difficult question, and I guess as cultural heritage managers, archaeologists are constantly thinking about the sorts of impacts that happen to heritage. So in this particular instance, we're talking about natural impacts. But obviously, a lot of the work that we normally do is actually thinking about the impacts that come from human industrial or other sorts of uses. So I think it's something that we constantly grapple with. The concept of how do we make sure that there is still a heritage record there into the future. I think the interesting thing about thinking about culture, about climate change, is in fact that it seems to be inevitable. I mean, some people would think that industrial development is also inevitable, and therefore it's an interminable, incessant, and cumulative set of impacts which that we constantly are battling. But it does seem, when you think about sea level rise, that is something that we cannot. I mean, the Dutch managed to stop it with dikes, but I don't know that we're going to be able to build a dike all the way around Australia to try and keep the sea level down, because it just is an extraordinary force and power and natural. And this comes to Chris's point about the difference between disaster and what is nature. And I think it also comes back to the way that the Aboriginal people that I work with on the coast talk about. They don't see a difference between nature and culture. And so it is about trying to, in fact, live with the natural changes, which are, the natural forces. So I find it personally challenging. I find it more personally challenging to go back to a suburb that I surveyed 20 years ago that was bushland and is now wall-to-wall houses. I think this must happen to Aboriginal people all the time on their country, where they in fact have things being placed on them. And I think that's the balance that we have to make as cultural heritage managers always, is that distinction between keeping something intact and natural, the wilderness concept, through to how do we in fact adapt that to the modern world that we live in.
Yeah, and we know from the IPCC report that came out a little while ago that quite an amount of sea level rise is already baked in, even if we could get to zero emissions tomorrow. I was stopped in my tracks a bit by, I was on a presentation the other day with Andy Pittman, who said that people will be dealing with the sea level change that's baked into the system already for centuries, if not millennia. So that's a pretty interesting challenge. So Tiffany, obviously sea level rise is relevant to the kinds of things that you're working on as well, but I wanted to pick up on a comment that you made about the fact that most, did you say no coral reefs have been listed for World Heritage for their cultural values? They're all for their natural values. Do you think if there had been a more cultural dimension to some of those listings, or a joint listing, that would have made any difference to the governance of reefs and the protection of reef ecosystems?
Yeah, I think so. So there's no reefs in Australia that have been listed as, so in the World Heritage System you can have natural sites and cultural sites, or mixed natural and cultural sites. There's like about 1,500 sites in the whole system. Most of them are cultural, about 250 of them are natural, and about 40 of them are mixed, natural and cultural, across the world. So I think the recognition of joint natural and cultural sites is behind everywhere. And listening to the conversation today, it's obvious that every natural site is also a cultural site. And Indigenous people don't make that distinction, so it is a weird distinction within the World Heritage System that probably isn't even really relevant today, given that most people reject the idea of pristine landscapes and so forth now, and always see humans in landscapes. So the only reef that has been listed for joint cultural and natural values is the Hawaiian Reef. There are four World Heritage sites in Australia that have been listed for joint natural and cultural values. They are Kakadu, Uluru, the Tasmanian Wilderness, and Willandra Lakes. But some of those sites, possibly all of those sites, are endangered in many ways too. So I don't know whether listing them like for their cultural values as well. Yes, I agree, it's totally important, but I don't know whether it would get us any further than where we already are now. I think the World Heritage System is very technocratic. You know, Chris touched on this idea of it only being able to deal with tangible heritage, and it might be that the World Heritage System is just not fit for purpose anymore.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a big challenge. We might come back to that point. Maddie, you picked up on the question of stories and the way stories have been passed down about volcanics in southeastern Australia, for example. What kind of stories do you think our descendants will tell about the present time?
Oh, I mean, we'd like to think that they'd be nice ones, but I think that there's a lot of cautionary tales that they'll tell of what is happening at the moment, surely. It feels like, you know, we're constantly thinking about climate change as being in the future when sea level rises, in the future when this happens, but these are things that are happening today and right now, and, you know, are we acting for the now or for the past? So I, you know, would like to think that they'd be nice ones, but I think that they'll be, you know, cautionary tales of what is being missed and what has slipped through our fingers.
Yeah, you also reminded us of the concept of healthy country as a way to go beyond this natural and cultural heritage distinction. Do you think there's a potential for healthy country to be something that the wider community can draw on as well in trying to live better in this land? Yeah,
I mean, country is for everybody. You know, we all live here and we all take part in it. And you know, if country is healthy, then it can care for all of us, and that's you know, something that we all need to take part in. I don't think that it's, you know, just for Aboriginal people to take care of country on behalf of everybody. Everybody has a responsibility while they're living here. In Melbourne, if you've ever been to a Welcome to Country with Auntie Joy Murphy-Wandin, or if you've read her children's book, she asks everybody that is welcomed onto Wurundjeri country to care for it. And that's something that I think maybe people lose a little bit, or they don't think about, but we all have a responsibility to country in some way or another. And that might be, you know, something small and tangible that you can do, or something big, you know, through the positions that you hold and the influences that you have. So healthy country is something that we all need to work towards, and it's something that will benefit us all.
Yeah, thanks. Chris, you had some really interesting points about disaster. Maybe you could bring up your third slide table while you answer this question, but perhaps this question doesn't exactly relate to your third slide. But the point you made about disaster being a temporal watershed and a point of cultural reflection and so on. To what extent do you think that happens in Australia, for example, after the Black Summer bushfires? We might have had a moment of cultural transformation there, but suddenly we had COVID to deal with. But do you think Australia is any good at that kind of temporal watershed from disasters?
That's a tricky question. I think modern Australian culture is as much about forgetting as it is about remembering. We do an awful lot of work to forget the past in Australia. Look, I think each of these significant events is a watershed, but it's the watershed that you make. It's what you make of it. And the conversations that we've had after the previous summer's bushfires have certainly been on a scale that I don't recall as a kind of general public conversation. So I think that's encouraging. I'm also reminded of Baimi Williamson's piece in The Guardian yesterday, where he talks about the inequity of disaster and how it's differentially distributed, so that Indigenous communities feel both the impact on the country, but the impact on heritage as well, in a way that many other Australians don't necessarily immediately grasp. So, yeah, watersheds for reflection, but you have to seize the moment. You have to make it a watershed as well.
Great, so many questions we could go, so many directions we could go. I'd like to open up now for the panelists to ask one another a question or converse with one another. So just wave your hands at me and I'll give you the floor. Who'd like to go first? Tiffany and then Chris.
So, thanks everyone. This is a conversation that I've been wanting to have with people like this for a long time. So I'm really grateful to be doing this. The question I wanted to ask is actually a question that Leslie raised in her introduction, and I've been thinking about for a while in relation to reefs. But it's a broader question that she articulated that I haven't really had a chance to think about. I thought others on the panel might have, or in the audience might have the perspective. So what we're seeing with reefs is a process of tropicalisation where reefs are moving southward and reef species are moving southward as the waters warm. And there was some speculation 5 or 10 years ago that the reefs would be okay because the reefs would just move to the cooler waters and their species. But now what we're seeing is that the heating is happening too fast and the species are not moving south fast enough in this so-called process of tropicalisation. So the question that Leslie raised was, does the National Reserve System need to move as climates move? And that raises like a really interesting social and institutional question about how we respond spatially and geographically to this fast and faster moving process of climate change. Does anyone have any thoughts or experience? I know there's experience with the Indigenous community in these processes that have played out over many years, and I think there's something there that we really can draw on, but I'm a little worried that some of these processes that are happening under climate change now are too fast for us to adapt to. So that's my question.
Anyone want to take that on? Take that on, because I think some of the CSIRO ecologists have written a bit about this. Prober and Dunlop have written some interesting stuff about, basically the impossibility of moving the National Reserve System very much, because much of it was the leftover lands after colonisation and after agricultural expansion and so on. And so there are a number of ecologists who started to talk about the necessity for dealing with loss, I guess, and yes, there are some moves to set up corridors to enable species to move and so on, but there's a lot of debate about how that might be difficult or impossible. Joe's got a comment.
I think there's also the issue. I mean, this probably almost relates more to a natural species perhaps than cultural heritage in terms of the ability of species to move. And I know the research about the marine reserves around the country, which were set up, a long time ago, probably are not adequate really to be able to be preserving fish stock and a whole range of other things. So it's not just reefs; it's actually everything in the water that's being affected by these marine heat waves that take out entire seagrass populations, which has implications in terms of sequestration of carbon and all those species that are actually focused on those places. And then where do they go? The seagrass doesn't regenerate quickly enough for those species to actually re-establish and then move again. I mean, I think it's a serious issue for the natural realm, but in terms of the cultural heritage, we've obviously got such variability around the continent anyway, in terms of things like tidal ranges, for instance. They're so much more extreme in the tropics than they are down in the south of the country. So already you've got these incredible impacts on heritage in that tidal sort of regime, I guess. So you've obviously got variable impacts everywhere already in terms of what nature is doing to our culture, and of course, which brings in Chris's point about disaster. I mean, a natural event is only a disaster if it actually impacts on your infrastructure or your house or various other things. And so again, we're talking about impacts which are going to happen in the future to the industrialized world, which are very, very different to a hunter-gatherer world over the last 20,000 years, where in fact people just continue to move. They obviously record those, they're different responses to those climate changes, but they aren't in fact, their entire city is not being wiped out. They're in fact able to move, and they're able to record and readapt to the landscape as it reforms. So I guess I think we're talking about natural effects. It's very different, and the effects on nature as opposed to culture. I think we're talking about quite different things in terms of both the past but also the future.
Thanks, Joe. So Chris, you had a question for somebody.
Yeah, and well, actually it's changed. It's morphed into something else, having listened to these last few exchanges. And it's really about loss and the dynamism of loss and heritage. I was really struck by Peter and Joe's demonstration of the loss of certain species in the landscape with climate change and sea level rise, and the gain of certain others. And also by Maddie's amazing juxtaposition of slides in an unexpected sequence, where she actually had the regeneration before the loss. And I think we have an enormous amount to learn from Indigenous communities in Australia and elsewhere about what loss actually means, because I think we've lost sight of the dynamism of landscapes, of communities, and their capacity to accommodate and understand and learn from these kinds of changing environments. So I'd be really interested, either Peter or Maddie or both, talking about what loss means in those kinds of contexts, and whether it might be a different kind of vision of loss as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think loss, when you look at it from an Indigenous point of view now, and that cultural context is something that Indigenous people across the country feel, a very sad loss about the loss of culture. And we can talk about culture being, in the forms of whether it's the animals, the plants, the sites, the country, the storylines, both the intangible and the tangible stuff that also, is part of culture. And for us, it's something that we in most cases where particular sites have been destroyed as a result of industry development on our country. It's a loss to the song line and the paths that crisscross the country that will never ever be seen ever again. So that loss is felt, I think, right across traditional owners. I think right across the country. It's not something that is felt with the particular traditional owner that owes the particular loss, but it's a loss that occurs right across the song lines.
Thanks, Uncle. I'll just add that I think, we feel these losses really keenly, but sometimes, especially, where in the southeast, we see that when there is a loss, whether it's a loss of knowledge, a loss of a site, loss of a special species or something like that, that to the minds of some non-Indigenous people equates to, there not being any importance of that to Indigenous people. So if we lose a site through to a development or things like that, that place is no longer important or no longer requires traditional owners to be a part of the decision making about that part of country. Or if we lose parts of our knowledge, and I'm particularly thinking about language, that means that those knowledges are lost forever. And what we're finding, particularly with language revival, is that the more that we relearn our languages and the more that we take up, the more that we relearn those knowledges that were not lost but dormant. And so I don't ever want to equate loss with not being invalid, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, that validity is not lost, even when these places are.
Thanks both, and thanks Chris for that important question. So I might broaden it out to the floor now. We do have some comments in the chat. So keep your questions coming, folks. So I'll go to a question from Kylie Brass. All of these presentations make me think about the relationship between research and policy. Kylie is the policy director for the Academy, so she thinks about policy all the time. But how do you think about policy impacts of your work and how to bring this knowledge to bear on policy problems at local, national and international levels? Big question. Tiffany, I might throw to you since you work explicitly on policy.
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. Some of my work is deliberately designed to unsettle the status quo, and I think that's an important policy impact, to challenge assumptions and to open up new policy debates. So that's one side of the work that I do. Another side is just basically, I guess you could call it co-production, working with policymakers and managers in partnership in the way I produce my research, so that I know that the questions that I'm asking are relevant and the results, there's a pathway to them being at least understood, if not adopted. So, but I think, a lot of the contemporary talk about pathways to impact and so forth is probably doesn't touch enough on the first dimension, which is opening new policy debates and challenging the status quo, and probably touches a lot more on the second dimension, which is a much more sort of positivist, normative kind of way of thinking about impact. Does that answer the question?
Thanks, Tiffany. We've got a question from Catherine Turk, which I think is for you, Chris, and maybe when you answer this question, Chris, you could share your screen with that third slide, the table. If we are to record and monitor the way climate change affects intangible heritage values, what sorts of ways should we go about this?
Sorry, Leslie, could you just repeat the question?
Yes, I just have to find it now that you're screen sharing. If we're to record and monitor the way climate change affects intangible heritage values, what sorts of ways should we go about this? How do we go about this?
Well, as you can see, the slide, and I hope it's more visible now, it's really in many ways a crude attempt to get down on paper the kind of holistic vision of heritage and transmission that most Indigenous communities have and embody and don't feel the need necessarily to articulate. So the focus that we've been trying to build on in negotiation with UNESCO and directly around issues of policy is how do we move these discussions of loss or safeguarding or preservation or heritage into a more dynamic mode? How do we understand heritage as having always been dynamic, and how do we exploit that dynamism moving into the future? I guess the other point that we want to make with this rubric, this mnemonic, and it's really a means of reminding people to think about and reflect on each of these other modalities, even as they're focused on just one element, whether it be world heritage or intangible heritage. But it's the idea that you can't transmit heritage, you can't transmit knowledge without all three of those modalities functioning really well. You've got to have functioning communities, you've got to have functioning environments, and you've got to have the knowledge. And so when Peter was talking earlier about the appalling loss and that sense of loss, it is about having strategies that work with all three of those modalities, healthy communities in healthy country with a knowledge that's still vital. So I don't know if I really want to go into the slide much more, but it essentially maps out those three different modalities and then talks about how they're articulated and how they're then transmitted. And only then do you get to understand how you need to safeguard things. So our argument, I guess, is that starting with safeguarding is the cart before the horse. If you don't understand how things become vulnerable, you can't then plan and develop policies to safeguard them.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'm just scanning for any hands that are up, but I can't see any. I know that Jill Huntley is with us and she had some interesting things to say. Jill, do you want to come into the conversation?
Yeah, hi Leslie, sorry, I was being a bit naughty and looking on my emails. Hello everyone, hi Joe. Yeah, I've actually really enjoyed this conversation, and I really, a couple of the take homes for me have been around policy and have been around this idea of disaster as opportunity. And I think that that's been a frustration sometimes for policy development, is trying to work across different cultures, because Indigenous peoples everywhere, and particularly Aboriginal peoples in Australia, are extremely resilient and extremely adaptable. That's why their culture goes back, more than 60,000 years. So I just wanted to maybe ask the panel, a lot of what we've talked about today you guys have talked about has been about sort of direct impacts and direct impacts to actually physical heritage. Do you guys have any ideas about how we go about dealing with some of those indirect impacts to the sort of more intangible aspects of heritage and heritage transmission? Is there any kind of policy framework for trying to help people be more resilient in those areas, do you think? Anyone?
Who'd like to have a go at that? Chris?
I don't think there's a cut and dried framework out there at all in the kind of intangible heritage area for the reasons that I've been suggesting. It doesn't lend itself to kind of metrics, measurements of transformation. What does emerge from a literature review that we're undertaking now, and I'm involved in a concept note for UNESCO, looking at climate change and intangible cultural heritage, which is due in Christmas. But what does seem obvious is that the relationship between place and community is absolutely critical. That when you move people off country, or when you undermine the country from people, with people still on top of it, you do break certain kinds of critical links. And those links are really difficult to reestablish. They can be profoundly shaken. So that notion of place, I think, is central to heritage.
Can I also just add something too, which is probably goes a little bit beyond the tangible and intangible, but it doesn't really. Certainly in WA, what seems to have come into the mix now as a way of communities being able to actually talk about the impact on intangible values is this version of policy, which is through the EPA Act. So instead of the Heritage Act, it's actually talking about social surrounds, and it's talking about people actually coming along later and saying, what is the effect of this massive open cut mine on my social landscape, which is, of course, talking about the intangible values that we all talk about in terms of country and heritage and attachments to land. Hello. So I mean, I think Gillian's question, getting back to Gillian's question about, you know, what is the policy about this? I think many heritage regulatory frameworks in Australia don't address this at all, really. I mean, because they are talking, most of the Heritage Acts talk about mostly the tangible in terms of the actual evidence, though there is anthropological and social significance in there as well. But the way that these things have been implemented is really, you know, almost in a policy vacuum in terms of directing things in the right way. And, you know, it's something that is obviously a gaping hole in terms of a substantive and, you know, coherent way of actually dealing with these sorts of issues, both just now, but in the future when we actually have different types of impacts which are going to be happening to sites and to landscapes generally.
Thanks, Jo. We've got a question from Sam Altman, and then I'll go to Alex Marston in the chat. But Sam, over to you. You're on mute, Sam.
Thank you, everyone. Great talk. Responding to Chris, are you aware of Carl White work in North America? Carl White is an Indigenous, Native American academic, and he makes a parallel between colonial effects on North American Indigenous groups who were, say, moved totally off one of their original country, traditional country, to a very different country, and how they re-established totally with different species and different places a new form, an adapted form of their Indigenous identity. And in fact, he makes the point that colonial experience is parallels climate change experiences as the sort of apocalyptic type things that seem to be in our future, in all our futures. So it's an interesting way of learning from from Indigenous people who have been through something similar, and how they did not lose their cultural identities. They just had, well, there's nothing easy about it, but they were able to re-establish their cultural identity. They did keep links with their traditional land by being able to visit it. In the work that Kyle talks about, it's the people moved from the Great Lakes to Oklahoma, very different country, but it's just an interesting example of resilience, massive resilience.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, I'm aware of Carl's work. He gave a lovely paper here a couple of years ago in Canberra, and a great example of resilience. I would maybe draw people's attention back to that third term in that sort of table that I showed you earlier. You know, there's tangible, intangible, and then there's the people, the communities. And at the end of the day, and we realized this in Vanuatu pretty early on, if you don't have healthy and educated and sustainable communities, you don't have either tangible or intangible heritage. The framework of the tangible heritage may survive, but its meaning will be lost, and you certainly won't have the intangible heritage. So if there was one thing that you would focus on, in fact, to make heritage more sustainable, it would be things like health outcomes for the community. And Meredith and I have often thought that if we were to come back in a different lifetime and retrain, we'd come back as doctors, because losing young Indigenous heritage managers to disease undermines everything.
And especially worrying with the COVID situation, especially in New South Wales.
Yeah, I think lots of parallels there with COVID, and how people look after one another is a really important kind of variable. So Alex Marston's got a question for Tiffany. If you had the power, if you were, do you want to ask the question, Alex? Go ahead.
Well, I put it in chat. Thank you. Really interesting webinar. Tiffany, the question was, if you had the power, what policy changes would you make at national, international levels? And for example, in your longitudinal study, which is a great idea to do, did you see any useful models for change, for significant change? Or also what in your other researches, what have you seen and what would you really like to advocate for and make changes in?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, I always think big.
Global government, no. The question is about UNESCO and the World Heritage System. I think the thing to remember is that it was part of the post-war project, and it's very much a project that is nation-state driven with the assistance of, technocrats in the advisory bodies, IUCN and ICOMOS. Individual citizens and activists and NGOs have really had to struggle to get their foot in the door in relation to different sites within the system, different World Heritage sites, and I think that is starting to change. And that will be a good change, because I don't think the current structure is working. There are certain nation states that are gaming the system, and there are scientists and experts within the system that insist that it's all about technical decision making, when clearly it's not. It's actually, there's a lot of politics going on, and the insistence that it's a technical thing is actually masking the politics, which is dangerous. So I think, bringing communities and individual citizens, NGOs into that decision-making space can only be healthy. It brings what's the so-called sunlight effect, shines a light on the politics. What's going on brings a level of transparency that's not currently there. At the national level, I think we need to have fast action on climate mitigation and adaptation. We're really behind. There's a lot we can learn from different communities. There's a lot we can learn from recent disasters, as everyone has said today, and we're really lagging. There's a lot of expertise in the academic community as well, but in terms of it being translated into policy, we're just really behind.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tiffany. There's a question from Todd Jones in the chat, but it's not quite finished. I can't see you. Okay, so you might have gone.
I understand what Todd is trying to get at there. I think what he's trying to say is that heritage frameworks may not be able to address rapid impacts, whether they're climate change or development or a mixture of both. And partly it might be because heritage frameworks tend to look to the past rather than the future. And maybe that's why we need to have other sorts of frameworks in addition to heritage frameworks, which are also about articulating multiple futures and how we get to them.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of heritage kind of connotes looking backwards in some ways, which is perhaps holding us back as well. Jill Huntley's got a question.
Yeah, if you'll indulge me again. So one of the things I've enjoyed most about listening to all you guys is that this is an environmental problem, but this is a human problem at its core. And I think the discourse around climate change has been dominated by the hard sciences for a really long time. So I just wanted to ask the panel, what do you think that we can do better or in a different way to have a bit more of an effect in those policy arenas, given that that this is something that's affecting people, and we haven't had that traction, as Tiffany was just saying. We haven't had a really good record of tackling this politically in our own society here in Australia. So, how do you think we can move this forward as a humanities type of an issue?
Can I start by answering that? I mean, I don't know whether there is an easy answer to that, because it does seem to be such a worldwide trend to be anti-intellectual and anti-science. And I think social science is probably even more marginalized than the hard sciences in terms of the way that people perceive that potentially, in a political way. I mean, I think that does seem to be the dilemma of our current global reality is the trigger finger reaction to things, and the fact that people do seem to think that if they have an opinion, and that's equally valid to someone who's done longitudinal studies of, like Tiffany's talking about on the reef, it does seem that people's personal opinions seem to have equal weight in the way that the social media and just general ways that people seem to interact with each other in this COVID trigger happy sort of reality, I guess. I don't think I've actually answered the question. I've lost track of it, but I think the real problem is that how do we, as scientists, as social scientists, actually get people to believe the results of the research and actually realise that in fact these are global cultural problems that we're dealing with, and that that there is, how do we overcome them? I think this is a question that I had for Tiffany originally. How do we overcome that cancel culture, Trumpism almost, of people having bizarre opinions which they consider to be equally valid and valent as scientists view?
One thing I think...
Can I just jump in before Tiffany answers that question? Because Jo, you and Peter have got these amazing animations that your team has put together. Have you had any, they're really important visualizations of change? Is that kind of way of telling the story having an impact in any of the audiences that I know you've both been doing a bit of a roadshow lately, so.
Peter, do you want to answer that? I mean, I think certainly if you show those sorts of animations, people have a much quicker and easier grasp of the sorts of things that you're talking about. The main reason we started creating those visualizations was to be able to take our results to the circle of elders, to be able to talk about the places we were going and to try and make them accessible to people who weren't able to necessarily get out into these remote locations. So, I mean, we're very much seeing those visualizations as a way of engaging, certainly more in terms of the public realm. And I think Peter's very interested in how, in fact, Murujuga as a group will actually mobilise that sort of medium into their visitors centre, which they're now thinking about for the northern part of the borough, which is a recreational area where they're actually wanting to open up part of that their heritage estate and to actually educate people more. It is about education, absolutely, and I think making it easily accessible and understandable is obviously the way. And that's certainly why we do them. Is we think that they actually do make our results more easily palatable. Everybody likes a movie rather than a still, that's sort of and certainly much better than reading a book.
Yeah, that's correct, Jo. I think for us, it's just been an opportunity for us to then, as I said before, make the connection between our cultural beliefs and have a multimedia presentation that shows the scientific view on what I think we've already known or understood for a very long time about the country.
Yeah, thanks both. So sorry, Tiffany, you were going to talk about populism or Trumpism or something.
I wasn't going to talk about populism, but what I was going to say is one of the things that Indigenous people and scholars of the humanities can unite on, and which they do very well, way better than biophysical and natural scientists and quantitative social scientists, is understand and use rhetoric, symbolism and emotion. And so that is where I see the role of the humanities in moving us forward. I think that's really powerful and underutilised in the current discourse, national discourse. So I am happy to work with any Indigenous people and humanities scholars who want to work on these topics, dealing with ecological grief, memorialisation, building those things into institutions and policy settings and policy frameworks. Like there's so much work that can be done there. And I should say that you will find many people like me who are really open and interested in participating in that kind of work.
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. We're coming to the end of our time, but I just wanted to ask Maddie, it's not so much a question, it's a comment really. You made the important point about urban areas still being very important as country, basically, and so that we shouldn't forget. We shouldn't always think of heritage as, you know, these remote places. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think maybe this sort of goes to what Joe and Tiffany were talking about in terms of how do we get people to care. And I think sometimes in urban spaces we sort of other things. So we sort of other the remote, and we other the impacts of climate change because they're happening somewhere else, and my comfortable life in my house with my air conditioning is different in the realities of places where, you know, water ingress is seen and sort of I'm in my bubble. And so I think it's really important that we remember that, you know, the place where you're sitting right now is still country. You know, every part of this place is still country, and it's part of an ecosystem in itself. And the impacts that we have here are felt you know, more broadly than just the life that we live here. So I think, you know, work that I've done with urban researchers, particularly in ecology, is really trying to assert that these processes that are happening in our cities are processes that are happening on country and have impacts for, you know, not only culture of traditional owners, but everybody living on country. So for me, it's just sort of, it's a really grounding thing to acknowledge that where you are, you know, beyond just a brief acknowledgement of country, but to really situate yourself, I think is really important. And I think that, you know, might be, I don't think there's one solution for getting people on board when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about the impacts of climate change and how that can impact policy. And I think that people's votes are very important. You know, this political element is incredibly important. So, you know, by grounding yourself in country and thinking about what your responsibilities are, even in an urban space, is really important.
Thanks, Maddie. That's a great note that we'll probably finish on, I think, there. So I just want to thank the panel for a really stimulating conversation. We could go on for a while, I think. Thanks very much to the audience for joining us. We really appreciate it. To let you know that there will be a list of resources and copies of papers written by the panel on some of the issues that they've talked about today. That'll be on the Academy website later this week, hopefully. And also note that the Academy Symposium is coming up in November, and we'll be going further on some issues about the humanities and climate change. So I hope many of you will be able to join us there, because it's we're going to be all online this year, for better and worse. So one of the better things is that it allows a lot more people to access the discussion. So please join me in thanking the panel, and thanks very much everyone for joining us, and we'll close the session.